Although we discussed the elegy as a traditional form prior to our spring break, I wanted to remind you about some of the key features and impulses of elegies as you continue your examination of the poems in our textbook. The elegy is a traditional form that expresses lamentation for the death of a revered or cherished figure. For many centuries, the elegy was reserved for more famous or prominent public figures, but in contemporary poetry, this form has been used to articulate individuals' grief over the loss of someone who is revered, perhaps by them personally, not necessarily by others in the general public. Many of the most famous elegies, of course, focus on famous and socially prominent people. But in either case, whether the subject of this lament is public or private, the poem is designed to evoke a kind of communal grief. The elegies that focus on someone who is famous, well-known, is going to be concerned with the loss that everyone in the community suffers as a result of this person's death. Those poems, those more contemporary poems that focus on more private relationships, still evoke a sense of the universal or communal by evoking in readers the shared experiences of loss and sorrow and the ravages of death. Because these are universal experiences that are common in human experience, readers can still participate in the grieving and then possibly celebratory expressions articulated by the poet, even if the individual being lamented isn't someone the reader knows. Often, although not always, there is a turn toward the end of the poem toward celebration or hopefulness. It can often be expressed by a recognition or belief in immortality, perhaps an evocation of nature and the very natural cycling of life. But we see this in many of the poems, including the ones in our textbook chapter. Some of the strategies that are commonly employed by poets when they are writing an elegy is a clear identification of the subject of this lament, and that will often be achieved in the title as well as in the opening lines of the poem. There is typically some kind of exposition about the circumstances of the figure's death or the destruction of the space that might be being mourned in the poem. We see this very clearly in Garrett Hongo's poem, The Legend, which is one of the pieces that you're going to be discussing with your peers this week. There is usually an invocation of some kind of communal response, an invitation for, at a minimum, the reader to participate in the grieving process, but often an invitation or invocation of a communal and ceremonial response to the passing of this person or to the destruction of a cherished space. There's very typically a catalog of the virtues or the beauty or the achievements of the subject of the poem. And there is this interplay between joy and despair, prosperity and loss, hope and discouragement in these poems. You will see this very clearly in Hirsch's poem, Remembering Paul Celan. There's a great deal of contrast in the language. Many of the details are beautiful, rich, colorful details, but by the same token, many of the words that Hirsch uses in the poem have very dark, despairing connotations. So that contrast is clear. It's what creates a lot of the tension in the poem. Frequently, you will see the personification of nature, and this is one of the ways that the poet extends the reach and the relevance of the individual's grief into the wider world by personifying elements of nature that creates the sense that everyone, including the elements of nature, are sharing in this grief process. Because many elegies are written by poets about other poets or by poets about other artists, there's frequently an invocation of the muse or muses. Artists celebrate and conceive of inspiration in many ways, and appeals to a muse, a belief in some external genius that speaks to and inspires the work of the artist, is a common belief shared by many writers. And so if a poet is articulating an elegy to lament and celebrate the passing of another poet, it makes sense that an invocation of the muse would be a part of that process. And frequently you see a fairly detailed description of the mourners, of all those who would be a part of the death rituals. Sometimes, particularly if the subject of the poem is a public figure, there will be a critique of the abuses or corruptions in society. Most artists have strong impulses to comment on what they see as both beautiful and broken in the societies they inhabit. And so an elegy is an appropriate place to reflect some of those abuses and corruptions that were perhaps addressed by the person whose life is being remembered. Sometimes you see the attribution of human emotion to nature. This will often be accomplished through flower and other floral or plant imagery, whether it's trees or ferns, flowers, etc. There is very typically a strong and clear turn late in the poem from despair to some kind of hope. I think you can see this in the legend, Hongo's poem, when he makes the appeal to the legend from his own past, the weaver who crosses the bridge and greets this older man who's been slain in the street by a random shooting. And very, very frequently, there is an expression in a belief in immortality. This belief is not always framed in a Christian theology, but a belief in some kind of life beyond mortal death is so common to religious paradigms that it becomes a pretty conventional element of this poetic form. So, some questions you might think about as you examine the legend by Gerard Hongo, the poem by Edward Hirsch, In Memoriam of Paul Celan, and as you look back to Espada's poem, Alabanza. These questions might help you to pay attention to some specific things in those poems. So first of all, think about how in all three of those poems, the writer is articulating a personal sorrow as well as discussing, public losses. But then also think about where you see all of these other fundamental elements of the elegy form showing up in these poems. How do these contemporary writers still make use of these particular characteristics, even if in very different ways from the poets who were writing in prior centuries?